You've been here before. You say something simple, not a declaration, not a challenge, just a thought. Maybe it's about how you see relationships, or work, or what matters to you lately, and before the sentence fully lands, it's already being pushed back. Not considered, not explored, pushed back. You say east, and without hesitation, they say west. Not because they've carefully thought it through, but because agreeing feels like disappearing. The conversation shifts instantly. What you meant as connection turns into correction. What you offered as perspective becomes something you now have to defend. And you feel it in your body first. Your shoulders tighten, your words get longer. You start explaining more carefully, choosing better phrasing, adding examples, thinking that clarity will fix this. If I just say it the right way, they'll understand. But the opposite happens. The more you explain, the more tired you become. And strangely, the more energized they seem, as if the tension itself is fueling them. You're trying to build understanding. They're bracing for impact. This is the exhaustion trap. Because what's draining you isn't disagreement. Healthy disagreement has movement, curiosity, a sense of building something together. This feels different. This feels like standing in a boxing ring you never agreed to enter. And here's the quiet realization most people miss. This conversation was never about being right or wrong. It wasn't even about the topic you started with. Something else was happening underneath. Something automatic, defensive, and deeply personal. You didn't lose your energy because you lack logic. You lost it because you were trying to connect with someone who had already decided to fight. And once you see that, the entire dynamic begins to look very different. There is a specific kind of person behind this dynamic. Once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. Not the loud debater, not the thoughtful skeptic, but the one who pushes back by reflex. We can call this pattern the reflexive contrarian. This is someone whose default response to another person's idea is resistance, not because the idea is wrong, not because they've carefully evaluated it, but because it came from outside of them. The moment a thought arrives from someone else, something inside them tightens, and before understanding has a chance to form, the opposition is already spoken. What makes this confusing is how subtle it can be. They don't always sound hostile. Sometimes they sound intelligent, curious, even reasonable. But pay attention to the timing. The disagreement arrives instantly, before curiosity, before reflection, before real listening has had a chance to exist. And here's the key distinction. A critical thinker asks questions to get closer to the truth. A reflexive contrarian asks questions to create distance. You might notice how conversations with them never move forward. They circle, they stall. Every point you make becomes a starting line for resistance, rather than a foundation to build on. Agreement, even partial agreement, feels rare, almost dangerous to them. Because for the reflexive contrarian, conversation isn't primarily about exchange. It's about positioning, maintaining a sense of independence, proving, often silently, I am not being influenced. I am not below you. This isn't arrogance in the way people usually imagine it. It's a protective reflex, an automatic push against anything that might place them in a receptive role. And once you recognize this pattern, something important shifts. You stop asking, why won't they understand me? And you begin asking a more accurate question. What are they protecting themselves from by never agreeing? To understand why conversations with a reflexive contrarian feel so disorienting, you have to look closely at what they are actually responding to. It isn't your idea, it's you. Psychologists sometimes refer to this pattern as automatic gainsaying, the reflexive tendency to negate a statement the moment it comes from an external source. There is no pause for evaluation, no internal check for accuracy or meaning. The rejection happens first. Analysis, if it comes at all, arrives later, already biased toward opposition. This is why the disagreement feels strangely detached from the topic. You might be talking about values, something broad and human, the importance of rest, the role of honesty, the meaning of commitment, and suddenly the conversation swerves. They start arguing about exceptions, edge cases, logistics, terminology. The point you are making is no longer on the table. This is called moving the goalposts. By shifting the focus from why something matters to how it's imperfect, they pull you out of your center. Now you're no longer sharing a perspective, you're defending it. And the moment you're defending, they feel grounded again, stable, oriented. But here's the part that's easy to miss. They don't actually care about the details they're arguing. If you conceded every logistical point, the opposition wouldn't end. It would simply relocate. Because the goal was never clarity. The goal was destabilization. Automatic gainsaying isn't about truth-seeking. It's about maintaining psychological distance. By rejecting the source of the idea, by rejecting you as a reference point, they preserve a sense of independence that feels essential to their safety. And that's why explaining more rarely helps. You're offering information to someone who isn't resisting the content. They're resisting the implication that understanding might require receptivity. At the core of the reflexive contrarian isn't hostility. It's something far more fragile. Insecurity. For someone with a grounded sense of self, agreement is neutral. It doesn't threaten identity. It simply means two people happen to be seeing the same thing from similar angles. But for someone with a fragile ego, agreement carries a very different emotional charge. To them, agreeing feels like shrinking. Somewhere deep beneath the surface, their nervous system has learned an equation that goes unspoken. If I agree, I lose position. If I align, I disappear. If I don't push back, I become less real. So when you share an idea, especially one that sounds thoughtful, values-based, or emotionally grounded, it triggers a subtle alarm. Not because your idea is wrong, but because it places them in a receptive role. And receptivity, to a fragile ego, feels dangerously close to submission. This is why conversations with them often feel strangely hierarchical. There is an invisible ladder in the room. If you speak with clarity, they feel themselves slipping down a rung, and the fastest way to climb back up is to find a flaw in what you said. Correction becomes self-soothing. By pointing out an exception, reframing your words, or introducing an alternative angle, they restore a sense of balance inside themselves. I'm still independent, I'm still sharp, I'm still above being influenced. But here's the quiet tragedy of this pattern. Every time they protect themselves this way, they sacrifice connection. Agreement could have been a bridge, a moment of shared reality. Instead, it becomes a threat to be neutralized. Over time, conversations lose warmth. Curiosity fades. What remains is a constant, low-level tension, as if every interaction is a test no one agreed to take. They aren't fighting your ideas. They're fighting the fear that without resistance, they might fade into the background. And in trying so hard to remain visible, they end up emotionally unreachable. It isn't dominance they're after. It's reassurance, earned through opposition, rather than trust. Think back to the moment these conversations usually end. You've explained yourself 3 different ways. You've answered every objection. You've watched the topic drift further and further from where it started. And eventually, something inside you shuts down. Not because you've been disproven, but because you're tired. So you stop. You change the subject. You go quiet. You disengage. And in that exact moment, something very different is happening on the other side. To the reflexive contrarian, silence is not fatigue. It's not emotional overload. It's not a boundary. Silence is interpreted as defeat. In their internal framework, conversation has never been an exchange. It's been a contest. And in contests, the person who stops talking first loses. They don't think they're drained. They think, I won. This is the illusion of winning. Your withdrawal becomes evidence of their intellectual superiority. Your refusal to keep sparring is reframed as an inability to respond. And that misinterpretation matters, because it creates a powerful reinforcement loop. Each time they argue someone into silence, their brain receives a small hit of validation, relief, certainty, a quiet sense of dominance. If I were wrong, they would have kept talking. This dopamine reward teaches their nervous system that opposition works, so they do it again. Not because they're cruel, but because the pattern has been neurologically reinforced. Conflict equals affirmation. Resistance equals proof of worth. Meanwhile, you're left with a particular kind of confusion. You know the conversation didn't end because they were right, but it still feels unresolved, as if something was taken from you. That's the cost of the illusion. They walk away feeling taller. You walk away feeling emptied. And the most painful part is this. Your silence was never a concession. It was an act of self-preservation, misread as surrender by someone who only recognizes victory when another voice disappears. Here is the realization that changes everything. The conflict between you and a reflexive contrarian is not a conflict of information. It is a conflict of cognitive platforms. You are not standing on the same ground, even though you're using the same language. You are operating from a platform of exchange. In exchange mode, conversation is collaborative. Ideas are offered, not defended. Listening is active. Agreement doesn't mean submission, it means alignment. Disagreement doesn't feel dangerous, it feels informative. The goal is mutual understanding, growth, and sometimes simply being seen. The reflexive contrarian, however, is operating from a platform of survival. In survival mode, conversation is not about learning, it's about protection. Every statement is scanned for threat. Every idea is evaluated not for truth, but for what it implies about status, control, and autonomy. Agreement feels risky. Receptivity feels unsafe. This is why the same conversation feels so different on each side. When you speak, you're offering a bridge. When they listen, they're loading ammunition. You're listening to understand. They're listening to respond. And because these platforms are incompatible, the interaction becomes exhausting in a very specific way. You keep assuming that more clarity will bring connection. But clarity only gives them more material to push against. The better you explain yourself, the more angles they have to resist. It's like trying to describe the beauty of a sunset to someone whose nervous system is bracing for the night. You're talking about colour and warmth. They're preparing for danger. You are not in the same experience, even if you're looking at the same sky. This is also why you feel unseen. Not misunderstood, unseen. Your words are heard but not received. Your meaning is detected but not allowed to land. There is no place inside them for your perspective to rest, because their internal resources are being used to maintain defense. Once you understand this split, something important shifts. You stop taking their resistance personally. You stop trying to translate yourself into a language they can't process. And you begin to see that this wasn't a failure of communication. It was a mismatch of operating systems. And no amount of explaining can bridge a gap that isn't about information, but about safety. From the outside, the reflexive contrarian can seem confident, sharp, unshakable, someone who always has a counterpoint ready. But over time, this pattern carries a cost, one that's rarely visible in the moment it's happening. Because when every conversation becomes a contest, depth quietly disappears. People stop sharing unfinished thoughts around them. They stop speaking vulnerably, not out of fear, but out of fatigue. It's easier to keep things light, surface level, or purely practical than to risk another round of resistance. Slowly, the reflexive contrarian becomes someone others talk at, not open up to, and intimacy can't survive that. Relationships begin to feel oddly thin, functional but hollow. Conversations happen but nothing lands. There's an unspoken understanding that emotional honesty will be redirected, corrected, or debated instead of received. The tragedy is that this pattern also blocks growth. When you must oppose every external idea to feel safe, learning becomes dangerous. New perspectives aren't invitations, they're threats. Feedback is interpreted as challenge. Curiosity is replaced by vigilance. Over time, their worldview hardens, not because it's been tested, but because it's been defended too often. They may win discussions, they may dominate rooms, but they rarely feel deeply known, and the loneliness that follows is subtle. It doesn't arrive as abandonment or conflict, it arrives as silence, fewer people seeking their insight, fewer moments of genuine connection, fewer chances to be met without armor. This is the hidden cost of always pushing back. By protecting themselves from influence, they also protect themselves from closeness. They remain intact but untouched, independent but isolated. And while opposition once helped them feel real, it eventually leaves them alone with the very insecurity they were trying to outrun. Before we go any further, there's a quieter question worth asking. Not about them, but about us. Have you ever felt that reflex inside yourself? That small, almost automatic urge to push back the moment someone else sounds certain. The impulse to correct, to qualify, to add one more angle, not because you fully disagree, but because agreeing feels uncomfortable. If so, you're not broken, you're human. Many of us learned early that staying mentally independent meant staying alert, that being influenced meant being naive, that saying, "you're right," somehow put us at risk of being overshadowed or erased. So the reflex formed, not as arrogance, but as protection. This is where an important distinction matters. Critical thinking is curious. It asks questions to get closer to truth. Reflexive opposition is defensive. It asks questions to stay separate. One creates understanding, the other creates distance. The goal here isn't self-judgment, it's awareness. Because once you can notice the reflex arise, once you can feel that tightening before the contradiction, you gain a moment of choice. You can still disagree, you can still think independently, but you no longer have to push back just to feel solid. That pause is powerful. It's the space where conversations stop being about survival and start becoming about presence. And in that space, something surprising happens. You don't lose yourself by listening. You become more fully there. Once you understand this pattern, the question becomes practical. What do you actually do with it? The first step is preservation, not persuasion. In the short term, the grey rock approach can be effective. This means removing emotional fuel from the interaction. You stop explaining, you stop elaborating, you respond with calm, minimal language. One phrase in particular tends to disarm the reflexive pushback almost immediately. You might be right. This isn't agreement. It isn't surrender. It's a signal that you're no longer participating in the contest. With no resistance to push against, the dynamic loses momentum. But grey rock is not a life strategy. Over time, you may need something firmer, clear boundaries. This sounds like, "I'm not interested in debating this," or "I'm sharing, not arguing." Boundaries don't ask for understanding. They state conditions. And sometimes, the healthiest option is a conscious exit. Not a dramatic cutoff, not a punishment, simply a decision to stop offering depth to someone who consistently turns it into friction. This can mean fewer explanations, fewer vulnerable disclosures, or less emotional investment altogether. It's important to say this clearly. Silence is not always strength. If staying quiet means erasing yourself, it becomes another form of self-betrayal. Strategic preservation is about choosing when to engage and when not to, without abandoning your own clarity. You're allowed to protect your energy. Not every conversation deserves your nervous system. Not every challenge deserves a response. And walking away from a pattern that drains you is not weakness, it's discernment. At some point, understanding becomes a choice. You can keep refining your words, sharpening your logic, searching for the perfect explanation that might finally land. Or you can recognize a quieter truth. Some people are not unable to understand you. They are unavailable to, and that's not a failure on your part. Choosing peace over precision doesn't mean you stop caring about truth. It means you stop placing your worth on whether someone else can receive it. You learn that clarity doesn't always need an audience, that walking away from friction is sometimes the most grounded response you have. When you no longer need to win the conversation, something softens. Your body relaxes, your voice steadies. You keep your integrity without carrying someone else's defenses. So the next time you say east and someone insists on west, let them go that way. You don't need to follow to prove anything. Truth doesn't disappear when it isn't defended. It remains quiet, intact, and yours. If this video put words to something you've experienced, you're not alone. This channel explores the deeper psychological patterns behind how we connect, protect ourselves, and heal. If you found this meaningful, consider subscribing. And if any part resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. Thank you for watching.